President Xi Jinping says that he is hopeful that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Beijing could help stabilize U.S.-China relations.
Burials have begun for those brutally killed by militants in Uganda on Friday, in the worst massacre the country has seen since 2010.
China's President Xi Jinping says that Beijing and Washington have made progress on a number of issues during U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's two-day visit to his country. Blinken met with President Xi on Monday, a meeting that was not confirmed until the last minute, and a snub could have been a major setback for relations between the two superpowers. Earlier, China warned the U.S. that it must choose between cooperation or conflict. Blinken is the first Secretary of State to visit China in 5 years, as tensions between the two world powers have been rising over a long list of disagreements and potential conflict points, including Taiwan, where China's most senior foreign policy official Wang Yi told Blinken there was no room for compromise. The U.S. is anxious about China's military activity around the self-governing island, as well as Beijing's refusal to condemn Russia over its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Beijing, meanwhile, accuses Washington of trying to contain its ambitions by imposing export controls on its advanced technology and pursuing security agreements with allies in the region.
Grieving families have begun burying their dead in western Uganda, while others search desperately for missing loved ones. It follows Friday's brutal attack by militants who killed dozens of pupils housed in 2 dormitories in a co-ed secondary school. Officials say at least 41 people were massacred and half a dozen kidnapped in the worst attack of its kind in Uganda since 2010. Some students were burnt beyond recognition. Others were shot or hacked to death with machetes. The attack has been blamed on the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, which has established ties with the Islamic State. They are largely based in the neighbouring Democratic Republic of the Congo. In response, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has vowed to send more troops to the unstable border region between Uganda and the DRC. The raids appear to have taken the Ugandan authorities by surprise. First responders only arrived after the attackers had left.
Some 200 people in the Greek port city of Piraeus marched to the offices of Frontex and the Hellenic Guard on Sunday, protesting their handling of last week's deadly shipwreck off the coast of Pylos. There are mounting questions as to whether the Greek Coast Guard should have intervened earlier to help get the migrants on board to safety. Up to 750 men, women and children from Syria, Egypt, the Palestinian territories and Pakistan were on board the vessel trying to reach Europe when it sank. A church service was held on Sunday at the nearby port of Kalamata in memory of the victims. More than 500 people are presumed to have drowned, although only 78 bodies have been recovered. To date, 104 survivors were rescued. The Greek Coast Guard and government officials say their patrol boats and nearby cargo ships had been shadowing the fishing boat after it was spotted by a surveillance plane from Europe's Frontex border agency. They say they offered assistance, but it was rejected by someone on board the overcrowded trawler.
Violent clashes erupted in the occupied West Bank city of Jenin on Monday, as Israeli soldiers and Palestinian militants engaged in a bloody standoff. The confrontation resulted in the deaths of at least 3 Palestinians, including a 15-year-old boy, while at least 29 others were wounded. Israeli sources say the fighting erupted when soldiers conducting a raid in search of wanted suspects came under fire. The incident is the latest in a series of deadly clashes to take place in the West Bank over the past year.
Swiss voters have approved a new climate law aimed at slashing fossil fuel use and reaching net zero by 2050. In a referendum, the legislation received the support of 59% of voters, according to public broadcaster SRF. The Nationalist Swiss People's Party had objected to the government's proposals, saying such measures would cause energy bills to rise. But a campaign by scientists and environmental groups argued the country's melting glaciers would soon vanish completely if greenhouse gas emissions were not reduced. The European Union's Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell has allocated €20 million to cash-strapped Egypt. The payment is aimed at helping Cairo cope with an influx of refugees fleeing the war in Sudan. Borrell also expressed support for Egypt's efforts to end the hostilities in Sudan, where a 3-day truce has just begun ahead of a UN pledging conference to raise funds for its humanitarian needs.
It's been a subject of discussion for more than 2 years, but choosing a successor to Jens Stoltenberg as NATO Secretary-General is no easy task. As well as good communication and management skills, a gift for diplomacy is essential.
NATO is a family of 31 democratic countries, and they have their interests. They don't always on everything see eye to eye. So the orchestra doesn't play by itself. You need a good conductor to keep the orchestra playing harmoniously, and therefore you need a good diplomat.
Many high-profile names are being talked about. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Ingrida Šimonytė, Lithuania's Prime Minister, or the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen is likewise being discussed. Could it be a female this time? Or someone from Eastern or Southern Europe following years of Northern Europeans at the helm? A consensus is needed within the now 31-member state alliance. And the US is likely to have a big say, even though Europeans have historically held the post of Secretary-General.
There are lots of talent out there, lots of potential candidates. So no reason why NATO should not be able to have an orderly transition. And I think that it's in NATO's interest to have that orderly transition.
One possibility is that Stoltenberg's mandate is extended yet again.
A prolonged period of high inflation. That's what the head of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, warns could be the reality for the Eurozone. Despite showing resistance to the knock-on effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the largest period of trade shock in several decades, economic activity remains weak, overshadowed by the threat of rising inflation.
Well, right now, the most important thing for Europe is to get a handle on inflation. Why? Because inflation is bad for growth and it is a tax on the poor. When we look into the medium-long term, critical for Europe is to spur more innovation and create more dynamism. There are pathways to do so, completing the banking union, advancing on the capital market union, make the financial assets of Europe that are quite significant.
In an interview with Euronews, Georgieva said high inflation could negatively impact growth based on the IMF's latest projections, indicating inflation could stay above the central bank target until mid-2025.
The EU is a very important player globally. The European economy is, if you take the whole 27 members, it is compatible to the United States, certainly compatible to China. How Europe pushes on respect for WTO rules, coordination and cooperation to reduce the cost of fragmentation matters. And let's remember, many of the European economies are small, open economies. If we undermine the engine of growth that is trade, that would affect negatively the European people.
Inflation in the European Union reached over 10% last year, but it is now showing signs of moderation. The European Central Bank forecasts that inflation will average at 5.4% this year and decrease to 2.2% by 2025. However, this forecast is still higher than the ECB's preferred rate of 2%.
It's the latest example in Europe of a coalition including the far right. Finland's new government includes Conservatives and an anti-immigration party, which came second in parliamentary elections. Not only the far right, but also radical left-wing parties are increasingly making their presence felt in the political debate. In a continent fractured by political cleavages, be it pro or anti-European, pro or anti-immigration, conservative versus progressive, the centre is facing increasing competition.
Le centrisme, c'est la recherche d'un consensus. Et à partir du moment où il y a clivage, et les clivages se développent effectivement beaucoup plus par le biais des réseaux sociaux, à partir du moment où il y a des clivages très forts, très durs dans la société, vous avez un affaiblissement du centrisme.
As social networks all but replace intermediary bodies, the Yellow Vests episode in France showed how people are turning from traditional parties to more spontaneous forms of organisation.
Ce n'est pas seulement qu'un phénomène politique, la montée des extrémismes. C'est aussi des phénomènes sociaux. Avant, vous aviez des partis politiques, des syndicats, des structures qui encadraient, en quelque sorte, qui avaient, si vous voulez, pour fonction l'encadrement. Maintenant, ces partis politiques dits classiques se sont effondrés.
But if the traditional parties themselves are in trouble, their ideas are often taken up by populist parties. Take Marine Le Pen's U-turn on Europe, for example, or Giorgia Meloni's shift over NATO and Russia.
On peut avoir des discours protestataires, on peut avoir des formes de populisme, mais lorsqu'on arrive aux affaires, et si on veut y rester, on se met à cultiver ce que l'on aurait appelé dans le temps un discours centriste. Les partis centristes ont perdu leur fonction dans le contexte actuel, puisque leurs idées ont été adoptées.
It remains to be seen whether the European Parliament, a bastion of centrism, will withstand the onslaught in the 2024 elections.
Today, let me